Okay, bam. Uh-oh. Your mic is muted. Oh, we're still getting set up here. Hey, everybody. It's Pete A. Turner talking to you live from the Break It Down show. Fred's getting himself set up, and then we will be rocking and rolling here in a second. So just hang with us. Got a couple extra seconds to delay here. You know how these modern computer things are. A little bug here, a little bug there. All right. Just if you know, Fred, you're still muted on your end. I can't unmute you. All right. Oh, I think we're getting there now.
All right. Go to
All right. Yes, we're doing it. We're going live here. Getting going. Fred's getting his stuff all set up. This is Peter Turner from the Break It Down show. Thanks for watching. Fred Galvin's going to talk about his book, A Few Bad Men. We'll be discussing that, but Fred had a little bit of stuff going on while he was getting going here. So let's give him another second or two to get ready. Are you ready now? I think he's ready. We'll see here. You're muted again. Can I unmute you? No, I can't. Oh, I can unmute you. Hey, great. All right, so I'm going to point at you and just say you're watching the Break It Down show. Bam.
Yes, thank you, Pete. Glad to be here on the Breakdown show.
Yeah, super fun. We're a couple of combat guys talking combat things. It's interesting when you sit in a room with the boss and something has happened. People have died. There's been some kind of accident or whatever, and it's terrifying because the person who. So this for the audience. Whenever we go somewhere, we're given a rules of engagement. It's very clear. Like this is how you escalate violence up to and including killing people. And so it seems clear, but then you see how murky it gets as soon as someone dies. You know, we had a guy, this is in Baghdad, the late phase in Baghdad, and a young kid in an MRAP. MRAP's like a giant moving house. And he opened up on a car and killed the people in it because they were approaching and wouldn't yield. And that kid's life hung in the balance while the commander got briefed from both sides and just sat there and thought. And ultimately, it's a coin flip, right? So the rules of engagement as laid out, as enforced, and as lived, man, they're all different things. And so you can get into an environment where all of a sudden you're politically, legally in trouble, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's completely out of your hands. You get put in a situation where bad things can happen, and now everybody else has a meeting to decide how they're going to proceed. It's terrifying to be in that meeting because you don't want to I mean, for me, I don't know anything. I'm just a dude, right? And so when these things happen, we often lose sight of just how much of a coin flip these things are. So Fred, thanks for coming on the show. I know you guys had your whole thing with your book that you lay out in A Few Bad Men, but have you sat in the room when it wasn't you and your guys and someone's life was in the balance and seen that brief before?
Not necessarily. I was, during my time, besides the time when I was going through an investigation and the trial, I was always forward deployed or training for that. But since retiring, I have received numerous emails. Hey, this happened to me. I don't know what to do. And can you talk? So to answer your question, Pete, I've been after I got out, the one who would give people a lot of pro bono. I'm not a lawyer, but
Right.
advice, counsel, and say, hey, I can recommend to use an attorney. And if it escalates from there, a legal defense fund. And here's how to, is as I later had to do, I had to do a campaign to defend myself because, as you mentioned, this is serious business. And
Right.
I remember just hearing this last week how Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that uh, Donald Trump told him, and he is referring, back to the senior leaders that work for Pete Hegseth, that I've got your back. And that's one thing I was refreshed to hear, that senior leaders understand that there's dilemmas. Sometimes there's a gray area, and
Right.
it used to be by default that you're guilty until this investigation proves you otherwise, and that's just a horrible situation for Marines, soldiers, anyone to go through that is doing their job. Now, I'm not advocating, just spraying and praying, but there's rules of engagement, and there's escalation. You fire in front of the ground, you fire into the engine block, people still don't yield. You fire in the windshield, you follow. It doesn't need to be some investigation where there's criminal investigative services, your life's hanging in the balance, you get sent home.
Yeah.
What happened to us was extraordinary, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Other people
Absolutely not.
had that
Yeah.
happen to them, and they were basically run through the gauntlet.
Yeah, you mentioned one of the rules of engagement, and this is just again for the audience, so you guys can understand. Before every briefing, we all talk about a most likely course of action, most deadly course of action. What are we going to do in these things? And it's often the same brief. You take it seriously, but it's the same brief because it's the same brief, same area, same everything over and over again. And one of the things that you quite often will say out loud is like you'll go through the escalation of your rules of engagement, and it was at times it was shout, show, shove, shoot, shoot, shoot. Now you can go from shout to shoot, any one of them instantly. You could skip steps if you felt threatened. You didn't have to do this every single time, but you had a framework. But again, all of the trust in that framework is that if you do these things, you'll be exonerated. And that's just not the case. And we're not talking about people who, like the guy who went in that mass murder spree. We're not talking about that. We're talking about 18-year-olds who have someone fast approaching towards their vehicle, have never had that happen, probably haven't trained on, like, you're going to be the gunner when a car is this far away, or a kid has something in his hand and he goes like this on the side of the street. Is that an arcade G3, or is that just some small pebbles we don't care about? Well, I wasted that kid. These things happen, and it's one thing to have on rules of engagement, but so I think you'll appreciate this, Red. So I was in, again, Baghdad, and the new unit came in. And so the units that stayed, that were housed there, don't know the new boss. They don't know the new sergeant major. And so we had personal locator beacons, everybody. You have these in case you get snatched up and the beacon goes off and here comes Delta Force. These guys are so terrified of a false alarm going off that they had electrically taped their PLBs into don't ever go off mode, because that's that command. And the new sergeant major had to come in and say, take all that tape off. If something happens, we'll deal with it. And thankfully, nothing had happened. The fact of the matter is, if something happened and they didn't like it, you get in trouble. It's so crazy.
You're right, Pete. And that's how unfortunately, here's the good and the bad. Conceptually, there's people like yourself who have the experience and judgment, and they don't rush to decision. Unfortunately, right. We in the military promote leaders not always based on merit. We promote some people because they attended the right school, literally a military college, and they looked fit and they said, yes, sir. They checked all these blocks, but they were not a leader. They were a follower, and it's very clear. So these people are always looking to capitalize on the way that, how can I get promoted? Now they're in combat, and what better way to be the critic, as Teddy Roosevelt would say, to to point the finger at the man in the arena, be the virtue warrior, stand up. I wouldn't do, these Marines, you know what they did? And circulate this rumor that is so heinous. This is how lawfare gets started, that you accuse somebody of something that we've all been briefed you can't do, and the enemy realizes our rules of engagement. And in our case, after when we got blown up by a car bomb, a van filled with shrapnel and fuel, detonated right in the front of our patrol, we got shot out on one side, then the other flank, some sniper fire, and we were clearly engaged in a complex ambush. But the Taliban, ironically, in 2007, their information warfare arm was so sophisticated. Now, it wasn't perfect at that stage in the evolution, but it was more sophisticated than we had. But they started riots. They had this narrative that the Marines, after we got blown up, and then they denied having any explosion, and no one was armed because there's no need for weapons in the first village on the on the Afghanistan side of the Afghan-Pakistan border. I mean, they're just spewing these lies and saying the Marines were drunk at 6 o'clock in the morning. And we left on the patrol at 6. This was at 9 o'clock, 3 hours into the mission, and that we went door to door looking for and killing women, children, and elderly. But if you're that stupid as a Army colonel that you believe something like that, and then even worse, I mean, I can see that there's some weak sisters that do get promoted, and they're a battle space commander, and that could happen because obviously, here's the very first Marine unit, and it's easy to pick on them. You do different things. I mean, this colonel actually briefed me when we first got there, and he said, when we first got here, there was a Marine infantry unit here, and they had tactics that were way different. They'd actually go in these villages and do raids, but we want to show them that we come in peace. Our commanders don't even have a machine gun or a turret gunner in the turret. We put a tire up there. I mean, it was just a totally different mindset and approach that happened in 2006 when General Petraeus, then Lieutenant General Petraeus, and Lieutenant General Mattis developed this Field Manual 3 TAC 24 counterinsurgency, which laid everything out. It even hijacked the Hippocratic Oath phrase of first do no harm. So you're planting that seed in Marine and soldiers' minds of be hesitant. And that's not what you want planted in their mind, especially when it's not a gray area, when it's a black and white, and you get blown up. When you say first do no harm, and then the whole underlying stock in this counterinsurgency strategy is winning hearts and minds. That didn't work in a nation that doesn't identify as a nation. They don't want a central government. They believe in Sharia law. It's tribal. So they didn't want, the only thing they wanted that we had to offer was the money that went around. And they quickly capitalized on this because we were throwing around Salacia payments. So they didn't need proof in 2007. They just needed to make a claim. No picture of a body, no physical body, no blood, no bullets. And they were getting 4 years of the average Afghan salary for making a claim. So like in America, if you could get $250,000 for just making a claim without any proof, people would be doing it all. It's a scam. So people would be doing it all the time. So the enemy exploited this, and so did our own military leaders, unfortunately. And when you read A Few Bad Men, I don't want to totally give it away. I could sort of see a weak leader like then Colonel John Nicholson, but what the Marines did was far worse because the Army kicked us out, and the Marines were embarrassed about this, and they just dogpiled. Of course, the Marines did not want a Marine Special Operations Command that was forced by then Secretary of Defense Colonel Rumsfeld, who ordered this. But the Marine Corps was like, we're going to just read the book and you'll see all the. I mean, it took me 11 years to get everything declassified from the courtroom testimonies, but you'll read these people's own sworn statement, and it's just the most commonly used word in these book reviews is "this is disturbing," but when it's quotes, that is verbatim what witnesses said during the longest war crimes trial in Marine Corps history, 3.5 weeks. And, it lays it completely out. It's not cherry picking anything. It's just, but that's an example of what can happen when we don't use unconditional warfare, the total war concept, when we go in there and try to win hearts and minds and use the military to do nation building. And I mean, it was failing, but when you look at, here's two generals that I mentioned, and one that became a general. But you look at David Petraeus, went to KKR and several other organizations that he's on the boards, and General Mattis is at General Dynamics, and then Colonel, who got promoted to 4-star General, John Nicholson, works for Lockheed Martin, the largest defense contractor. It became the No General Left Behind program, where, hey, not only will you play by these rules, but you'll get promoted to 4 stars, and then you can have this life happily ever after that just doesn't ever go away, because we'll be in this forever war. And that is what happened to all the players. You read every single person in this book that did what they did. They all retired. Almost every one of them retires a 4-star general, and they're working for these large military defense firms as members of their board of directors, where they went from making $200,000 a year to making almost $1 million in most cases, like General Mattis, or more, and they work for several boards.
Yeah, it makes me really upset when I think about these things. It's a topic I typically avoid. It's fine in this case, but it makes me so mad that something like Abu Ghraib happens. And I don't know that there's anybody who went to prison who wasn't owed anything. Someone lost their command. So what? This is, you put improperly trained people into a prison facility to do things. The dog, I happen to know the dog handler who wasn't part of the Abu Ghraib specific thing that we're all thinking of. He was there, but he was put into a situation with his dog that was outside of the legal norm. There's supposed to be space, and he was stuffed into this small little cell with this Iraqi guy. And he's like, I can't go in there. You're ordered to go in. Well, now you have a problem. You have something that's against the rules and a legal order. So he goes in. Afghans, anybody sees a working dog is going to freak out if it's coming in there. And then the picture, it's all the picture. It's this big, strong army guy, and he's got the dog healed up. But it looks like he's having the dog attack this poor, barely, almost naked Iraqi dude. He went to prison. He went to prison for that. Alan West, not a collector, colonel, fires a gun by a detained person's head, not prison. So I don't know what the answers are, right? But they're not equal. And so you have something that goes, how do you get a fair trial when your picture and this dog is on the cover of magazines, and it's just, it's right. Unfair. And then I would be even further critical and say, hey, the hearts and minds thing is great, except for you guys didn't orient properly. And I would say this to General Mattis's face, any of these guys' faces, you got it wrong. You're 0 for your career in combat. And it's the Afghans, it's the Iraqi government people that needs the hearts and minds. And so when we peace out and disappear on those folks, never come back to that district again, that's not what you do. And it's completely wrong-headed. And so you put people who aren't trained. I can say this because I stayed in the areas, and usually the units rotated over the top of me. So I could predict the next unit's future because I'd seen the last 2 or 3 units do the same thing. And so you take people who are undertrained, underskilled for this thing. Not that they're incapable, but they've been trained. If you're in artillery and you deploy, you prep by shooting artillery rounds, and then you don't shoot artillery the entire time you're there. Or my favorite one's the tankers, and I love my tanker friends, but this is for anybody watching. The tanker slogan is death before dismount. And so they get to Afghanistan, and the first command you basically hear is dismount. And so these people get put in these impossible situations where you don't know who has your back. And again, we're not justifying illegal violence or anything, but you go out village to village, all these situations where anything can happen. And I think about Paula Lloyd, who was burned alive, and in front of her interpreter grabbed the gun and shot the guy that burned her. And he didn't know that she was going to die, but it's pretty obvious, right? And he had to deal with a court problem. And
Yeah.
How do we get to that spot? And because he was a civilian, it was a different kind of problem than a military problem. And it's like, what are we doing? What are we doing when the guys who go to the Niger Mali conflict with the Green Beret team that gets killed, look, those guys are always underfunded. Marsoc, you guys know, like there's always like, here's what you got, go do the job, and you do it. You guys love that stuff, but to then come back and start blaming them when a lot more should have been done to protect those guys from that outcome. Maybe they still maybe more of them die. Who knows? But that wasn't. No general should be proud of that outcome and say, "Yep, there's no fault here, my fault." Like, no, if you're a lieutenant and you don't know where your guy is, you get in trouble, you lose your job. If you're a general, you don't know where your guys are. It's like, I don't know. It's too big of a unit. I can't handle it all. That shit pisses me off, man. I'm sorry to go on a rant there, but this goes into this whole picture of bullshit that you guys got swept up into.
You're right. And some of the evolution that occurred, you mentioned Abu Ghraib, but there's about 6 incidences that happened. Abu Ghraib was one of them. And then there was incident in Fallujah with then Marine Second Lieutenant Ilario Pantano. And there was the Haditha incident, the Hamdaniya incident. They had the Pat Tillman case in Afghanistan, which, thank God to Mary Tillman, she kept pushing after 5 investigations and got to the truth. And it showed that, there was deception and cover up all the way up to, the White House level. It involved then some very senior leaders in the Special Operations Command that covered up the death of Pat Tillman. So at this stage, because of these incidences that I just mentioned,
right,
the bias in 2007 was, hey, you know what? Because the Haditha incident really led to this, where, they said if they had investigated immediately and fully, if they really go dogpile. And so that's what happened in our case, because then at that point, a commander can never be on the wrong side of things if he immediately, swiftly goes in and just dogpiles with this investigation. But at that point, that creates hesitancy. Who wants to go outside the wire and have to get in, engagements and firefights if your own people? I mean, they dogpiled on us with 45 criminal investigators and 4 prosecuting attorneys on 7 Marines. So we don't fight odds, as you know, Pete, where there's 7-1 odds, where you're surrounded by and outnumbered like that. That's, I mean, we will if we have to, but we don't go into situations like you said. There's the most dangerous course of action, most likely course of action. I mean, if it's brief and there's intelligence that, hey, we're outnumbered 7x, then we don't, we're like, hey, you know what? We need to plus up and we need to get some air support, artillery, and, we can't fight with these odds. But what are we doing when we, do stuff like that? And then you read the book and you hear how this young Marine sergeant, he was driving the 2nd Humvee that got blown up by this car bomb. Well, the prosecuting attorneys dress up in civilian clothes like Naval Criminal Investigative Service and threatened to this Marine that they will deport his family if he doesn't sign their prepared statement that was different than the one that he signed in Afghanistan by the Article 15-6 preliminary investigator. And he admits on the stand that, hey, I signed these 2 statements. The reason there's a big difference is, I was under duress. And when you start doing tactics like that to win, and there's a problem. I don't want to turn this into a story about military law, but some of these prosecutors, they get promoted because they won a big case with the very first Marine Special Operations. This is a massive law of war violation case that was all over the New York Times and Washington Post. And I'm going to prove that the Marines did it. So you have these people, and the military law is different than in the civilian court. MARSOC, as you know, Pete, and your listeners, let me explain the difference. Is the Marine Special Operations Command is a closed loop system. So now, and this has happened to several others, unfortunately, after our case, you have a situation where once you're in MARSOC, you're not going to get out. So that convening authority is the senior Marine general officer that's overseeing this case. And if he gives a wink and a nod and wants something to go a certain way, he is the one who actually vets the panel members. That's in the civilian world, those are jury members. So there's no other situation in the United States where the boss who's made the decision to kick you out, to dogpile with 49 criminal investigators and prosecuting attorneys against 7 guys, he's the one that ordered all this. And he's not going to go back. You've never read a headline saying this general said he was sorry, he made a mistake. If you can find one of those, let me know. But so they went this far, and when they're picking that jury pool, they're in charge of everyone on that jury's pool's promotion, retention, their next duty station. So, if the boss gives you a wink and a nod and you're in the jury pool, you've got a family, you've got a house, a mortgage, kids. There's no equivalent in the civilian side where a judge has your future employment, or he can blackball you from employment. That doesn't exist where there's that level of we call it in the military unlawful command influence, which is basically coercion. But it's we did get exonerated at the end of the trial, but they used non-legal terms, Pete. So legal terms, as you know, innocent or guilty or dismissed. It can end up in one of those 3. But here's the longest war crimes case in Marine Corps history. Here's a case that has the highest number of falsely alleged civilians killed by machine gun fire. They said we killed and wounded 69. They said we killed 19 and wounded 50. And you don't use legal terms at all. They just said we acted appropriately according to the rules of engagement in tactics, techniques, and procedure for a complex ambush. So using a phrase, a weak, mealy-mouthed term like acted appropriately, that led the media in 2008, after a courtroom case ended, to, they didn't say they were innocent. They never said they were not guilty. So they would constantly do these drive-bys. And I went on to serve 7 more years in the Marines, but you just have to suck it up when you're in the military because, during that trial, we had a gag order on us. We couldn't talk to the media. And, you're going to think I'm an idiot because as soon as I got, exonerated, there was 2 of us that went to trial, myself and one other Marine. And as soon as we finished and we were cleared, which took them 6 months, I went back overseas and immediately deployed as soon as I could back to Afghanistan. And a similar incident, a separate one, happened, and I'll let you guys read the book on that because this is where the commanding officer was dropping bombs on his own guys, and I, as his operations officer, had to say, you can't. This is against regulations. You cannot do this. You're dropping massive ordnance so close, 5 times within the acceptable fratricide distance. But he did it, and I objected, and I got relieved, and then they sent me to another trial to kick me out of the Marine Corps. Which the Marine Corps is, if you go to a trial, if you walk into a courtroom, the conviction rate in the Marine Corps is 96%. The next highest in the world, Pete, is 92%. That is in a country that people know doesn't have very good, civil rights, and that's the People's Republic of China. So you beat 2 of those trials, which I did, and then the Marine Corps is like, hey, this guy needs to just go away. And it's interesting, but I survived. But I went on to make sure that others who are in cases where they're falsely accused and there's incontrovertible evidence that they were doing what they should have been doing. We can't win wars if you don't have the right of self-defense. And that's where the enemy plays in that gray area with their information warfare, is they understand our rules of engagement when they get advertised and let out, and they exploit those gaps. And they don't want you to be able to fight back because they want to make situations where it's questionable. and they are very good at inciting riots, putting this out on the internet and worldwide media. Because after Mr. Pearl, who's a reporter, got his head cut off in Afghanistan, they stopped using Western reporters, and a lot of times they put people embedded in military patrols, or if they couldn't get there soon enough, they would pay these sources. So if you're paying somebody in a local in a Taliban controlled town, talk about influence. That guy's going to write a very biased report. That's what it got to. And the military, there really needs to be accountability. I was really pleased to hear when Secretary of Defense Hegseth said, I want you to know, and my boss let me know that I've got your back. You do the right thing, got your back. Let's make it clear. When some guy comes out of investigation, don't use some mealy-mouthed phrase like acted appropriately. Make it definitive so the world knows these are legal terms. They're innocent and they're not guilty.
Yeah. Man, you said a lot there, and I just kept thinking of all these circumstances that happened. You recall in 2004 when the Chow Hall up on by Mosul Airfield blew up. Well, I'm one of the counterintelligence agents working in that area, and rightfully so. When that investigation team came up, I'm not going to use the lingo because no one's going to know. So they whenever these things happen, everybody, they send up somebody, usually higher ranking, maybe a colonel, maybe a captain, whoever it is, somebody who's appropriately ranked to go in and do this. In this case, they sent a general, and they were going to find out what the hell happened. There's a guy walked into an American dining facility and exploded a vest and killed people. By the way, we were supposed to be there that day too. We happened to go to the other dining facility because we got a little behind schedule, and so this is an area where I was living and I was working, and because we're counterintelligence assets and we are checking out all the people coming to work on the camp, they came to talk to us. But the initial thrust was, what did you guys do? Thankfully, it went our way, and the person doing the investigation did a real investigation, and we were never really considered a threat after the first contact. But that could go any way. Like, it's not my hands. Not only was it not in my hands, no one ever talked to me about it. So they talked to my boss, who did a good job, and everything got off of our backs, and we did our best to help them. But just that one thing. And if someone decides to make their career on this and making sure these, we were contractors at the time, these goddamn contractors, that would have been it, and that easily could be the case. Yes. Where these things happen. And you see this over and over again. I was going to show this picture of Michael Smith with his dog. This is the picture they put all over the news when he was on trial. And look, that looks terrible. That looks terrible, right? But does that represent what he actually did? Should he have been in close quarters like that? Like whenever you see a working dog, they're always like, back up. This is a working dog. There's so many times where somebody else's advantage is taken over the person who's sitting in the lurch, and you don't even do anything. There are so many times where we're driving along on our vehicles. I've been on a lot of combat patrols. I've seen a lot of crazy things. And all of a sudden, ting, 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 there's bullets hitting our vehicle. The command is drive through. That's it. And you just, to your point about like, we're not going to engage. We're not going to kill anybody. We're not going to harm anybody. We're just going to push. So we had all kinds of things thrown at us, blown up. They would come up and act like they had hand grenades and then throw a rock at us, and can you imagine if we shot a kid who had a rock in his hand?
Yeah.
Oh my God, and you don't know that you don't know what's going to happen. And so we were waiting until the last possible second to respond. Thankfully, my job was not to be in a gun turret, but you don't know. And by the way, there's IEDs and there's, this sounds crazy, everybody. This is how they fight. There's bombs in trees. Like when Soleimani got killed, I was stoked about that because that guy and his friends hung bombs on my tree in trees where we would drive and kill people. And so we have all this asymmetrical warfare to go with our asymmetrical warfare, and it put people in impossible situations over and over again. And thankfully it went right most of the time. But you're right. Once you're in that courtroom too, even if you stay in the Marines, like you're not going to promote to colonel or full colonel. It's just not going to happen because that thing is going to be sit there and it's always going to be part of your military existence.
Yeah. It's a scar. And, we're not going to promote you. You said a lot of things
Yeah.
that bring to mind, the combat it's a verb. It's not pretty. And the enemy is they don't have periods where, they go back home and do a refit for 6 to 12 months. They are there the
Yeah.
whole time, and they do after actions, and they learn what works. And okay, with these Marine special operators, we didn't actually have any bodies or bullets, so we're going to evolve this and make some tweaks. And next time we're going to throw some people under white sheets
Mm-hmm.
and sprinkle a little animal blood and make it look like people were killed. And then there's going to be investigators come. So we're actually going to kill some of these civilians. This is what the Taliban does and has done.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and, they want to put us not on the horns of the dilemma. They want us to put us in a lose-lose all the time situation where
Yeah.
we go and we get ambushed. And like you said, there's an invisible enemy out there that ignites and detonates a roadside bomb. So that's
Mm-hmm.
that's not something that you can point the trigger man out and see where it come from. So, or it's a pressure plate. You roll over something. So now there's this huge blast and there's debris everywhere. There's a fog of war. And as you said, there's a little kid who's, you know, throwing something. It's unclear, but
Yeah.
you you basically you're going to make, you know, a bad decision, because that can be in certain times somebody who is another suicide bomber. And that's what they're waiting for is, are these military personnel, are they going to dismount? And in our case, they sent another vehicle as soon as we got blown up, a Toyota Prado. That's like a sports utility type of vehicle that they sell in Asia. They sent another Toyota Prado with a driver and three other jihadists. The jihadists were firing outside the vehicle. Their AK-47s, fully automatic, and they were heading to T-bone our vehicle that just got hit, which was distinctly different than the rest of the Humvees and the patrol. It was the only one, as you're familiar with, Pete, that they have Humvees that are fully enclosed. They call them up armored Humvees, and then they have these ones we call highbacks, which you can have people in a troop compartment, or you use as basically an ambulance in case there's casualties. And the one vehicle that was a highback, and it looks completely different. And they know that you load casualties on there. And that's the one that they targeted. That was the one that they detonated on. The enemy is not afraid to attack they don't play by the Geneva Conventions and our rules of
No.
engagement, no matter what. So they hit
Right.
that vehicle. It's obviously less armored than a completely enclosed vehicle. So they hit it. And at this time in 2007, they knew that, shrapnel kills, but fire punishes on top of that. So anyone that does survive, and
Yeah.
the psychological, trauma that goes on when you see one of your buddies not just filled with shrapnel, dying or screaming, but now somebody's burning with massive
Right.
third-degree burns all over their body, just melting. That creates hesitancy of people not wanting to go out on future patrols, and that's what they did to that vehicle.
Yeah.
Luckily, the only one that was hit was the turret gunner, and it knocked him down inside the turret, rung his bell, because this one detonated point blank right on the front bumper of this Humvee, and that gunner was on fire. He immediately stood back up to his feet and saw this heading Marine with a light machine gun, what we call a squad automatic weapon. He stood up in the back of that troop compartment and aimed in with the gunner, and with the assistance of the turret gunner in vehicle one, they just made quick work of that Toyota Prado. But then they started getting hit on the other side. How do I know? I mean, I was on the patrol there. I saw it with my own eyes. The ambush, we left at 6 o'clock in the morning. The ambush happened at 9:03 in the morning. And so, yeah, we got caught in the middle of this complex ambush, shot at on both sides of the road, and then sniper fire. And then they dragged a vehicle across the road, blocking us in this kill zone. So, but when you read the back of the book, your listeners really, I encourage you, get the hardback and go to Appendix 3 and read these 79 Afghan witnesses that are making all these statements, and they're so contradictory. Some of them admit to the Naval Criminal Investigator Service that I was told by my tribal elder to come here and I would get compensation, because the Army, who was a battle space commander at that time, they were giving salacious payments to anybody that made a claim. No proof required, but 4 years average Afghan salary for just making a claim. And you read these statements after statements, and then they said, of course, Naval Criminal Investigative Service is different than the actual Army battle space commander. When the NCIS investigator says, "Hey, I'm here to investigate and get to the bottom of this. I don't make salacious payments." These guys would all walk out on them. They were just there for the money. And you read all these statements. I know in your background in counterintelligence, I mean, you are trying to cut through, the BS and find out what the facts are and what's really going on in a situation like this to protect the force. Because a lot of these people, it's very untrustworthy situations. Some of them just may have a beef against somebody else, but when you have this bias and what the truth is, and this is, I can't really forgive the Army colonel that led us in the Air Force colonel who was the actual investigating officer. They knew what the truth was, but then the Marines, they brought in all these criminal investigators, and they knew for sure. After you read these 79 Afghan witnesses, they knew exactly what the truth was. They had the Army Criminal Investigative Division. They knew what the impacts on our vehicles were from the Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle. And the Air Force colonel, that's right, Pete, I'm not crazy. I said Air Force colonel. They appointed to be the investigating officer in Marine Special Operations Task Force. They got ambushed. And this guy was saying, well, I think that in the fog of war that you guys turned around and shot your own vehicles. And it's like, well, these impacts, there were impacts on the sides of our vehicle. And then later it was proven to be from a Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle. I mean, we didn't have those weapons and those caliber rounds, but it just went on and on. Guys had a very biased approach to the investigation. In the courtroom, in the military, they call them panel members, otherwise civilian knows jury members. They did get the investigation right, but then it was classified and very little got out to the media. The media was in the courtroom for 3.5 weeks, but every time the defense had a witness that had exculpatory evidence, they would move not into the lobby to where somebody could hear something if somebody went to the bathroom. They moved them 2 buildings over on the 2nd floor. They did not want the jury. They wanted them to hear one side, which was the prosecution. And this was an adversarial process. It was a court of inquiries, by definition, is supposed to be a fact-finding, unbiased process, but it was everything but unbiased. It's very prejudicial.
Again, it makes me angry because, again, these folks who are in charge and supposed to anticipate and get us ready, they leave you guys out there swinging. There are, again, so many of these stories where things go sideways. My buddy John is a very special kind of soldier. He's a lawyer. He's a lot of skills. And so he's in Afghanistan, and he's a guy that fixes problems, kind of a free agent. And he gets called to a situation where I'll say guard folks in the guard. This is late stage Afghanistan. And they had been trained to, when there was a problem, to fan out and take over the whole road. And this was no longer the actual practicing TTP. So these guys so everybody watching, before you deploy, you get trained up on the current ways to deal with an IED or whatever it is. And so these guys do something that's way out of date. We're no longer blocking the road and stopping Afghans from doing Afghan business. So they're in the wrong era with their practices. That's not their fault. That's the folks who trained them, and quite often, like I'd go through pre-deployment training. Fred, how this goes. You get up there and there's some guy and he's like, this is how you do it. Man, just great. However you want to do it. I know my job. I know what to do. And it's like you don't even take them seriously because like they don't understand the fight. Anyhow, so these guys get themselves in a pickle, and the Afghan army starts shooting at them, pink, shooting because they had killed Afghans in this whole environment because some guy in his little truck drove up and he's like, I'm not waiting for you guys. That's not what we do. And so innocently driving up and they shot and killed these guys. And so the plan that John came up with was to get, he happened to know the Afghan commander. And so he's like, hold off. I'm going to take care of this. Then he goes into pops his head into the portal in the army vehicle. And these guys are freaking out because they're going to get assassinated by this crowd. They hate them and they're going to attack them. It's going to get bad. And so John said, if you guys would let me put on a bit of a show and smack you with my hat, I think I can get you out of this. And I'm making a very long story short. So these guys pop out and John's like, smacking him with his soft cap, right? And kicking him in the butt and stuff. And then you made a show of this thing. And then the Afghan army was like, that's going to be good enough if he did that. So he talks and performs this thing to get this unit. And there's an actual live news story of this thing too, with him smacking his hat on someone.
Wow.
The reason why I say all this for everybody is what we think reality is. This is the thing I learned from being a counterintelligence guy. And what reality is are different things. So when I'm in Shajoy in Afghanistan and I'm talking to the locals and I'm working on a Romanian camp, primarily Romanian run. There's Americans there, but it's Romanians. And when I'm talking to the locals and I'm like, hey, one thing that we'd like to fix is that all these Russians are driving over people and they're killing them with their trucks. And I'm like, Russians? What do you mean Russians? Russians? You mean Russians? No, again, I checked 100 different ways. They meant Russians. And I'm like, there's no Russians here. And they're like, no, there's Russians here. And they've always been here. You are not going to convince those Afghans that they're not Russians there. And this is deep in Taliban country. And so you bring this back to the command. This is so like warped world. They're like, there's no Russians here. And I'm like, it doesn't matter, sir. And I always say it's affect over effect. You guys are trying to do daily operations to create, this win. And they're not following you guys emotionally at all. Like they think that there's Russians here and they're being killed. I don't even know if any Afghans are dead. I couldn't even confirm that. Right. But these alternate realities happen. And again, you guys are trying to navigate through this in an operational environment. And so if someone picks you guys for some kind of weird attack or they gin up this performance that they're going to put on, you have no idea what to do about that. There's no TTPs. There's no, thankfully now you can record more things and there'd be more evidence. But back then there wasn't. And so it's just amazing all the different ways that the enemy can use non-traditional things to make a new reality. And you're left dealing with it. And I'll say one more thing about the military process is there's a guy who was an Army guy and then people got murdered and he got swept up in this murder investigation. Maybe he killed these people. Maybe he did not. It's a very famous case. His name is Tim Ennis. What we do know, whether he did it or not, is that the female adult victim has DNA evidence, scratch, under her fingernails. And Tim can't say, please test that because I didn't do that because there's no legal case for it. So someone who's been tried 3 times for the same case, right? Once with a mistrial, once he was exonerated, and then he went back into the Army, worst decision ever. And then they got him on UCMJ. So he's probably in Leavenworth, right? And he could potentially be exonerated or confirmed that his DNA is not the scratch DNA, but they won't do it. And so that's the system that you fight where I'm not going to give up my conviction. I have the right guy and they're not compelled to do the right thing at all. And so they're not going to use the right language. They're going to use this language that's prejudicial. And no one's going to come to your crew and say, hey, there's jobs at BAE for everybody. Sorry about that. They're not going to ever do that.
No, you're professionally literally destroyed. You come out of a case like that where, especially in our case, you go on serving for 7 more years, all those drive-bys in the media, people remember that because this was a large war crimes case. And then when you get out, it's not just very difficult, it's almost impossible to get a regular job because people think like you're Jeffrey Dahmer. Why would I hire this guy? I love America. I served for 27 years, but I will say this, that there is a strong bias in the civilian workforce against people who are older. So when they see somebody, you think that people, oh, thank you for your service. But when they realize that you've served over 20 years, they don't think that's patriotic. Most human resources and recruiting departments see that, unless you're going for another government job, which sometimes after something like this happens, you don't want to do. But they look at, look at 20 plus years as you've been institutionalized. You know, you're too rigid, you can't fit in, and you're not a good fit for this organization. So then you add what happens in these headlines, which good luck if you want the New York Times or Washington reprint a retraction. That's don't hold your breath for that.
Right.
I talked to these reporters and they refuse. Even in one case, I talked to a reporter and he was with the Military Times and he went later to work for the Washington Post. So I'd talked to him all about the details of our case when he was with the Military Times. And then he goes over to the Washington Post. He writes this sensationalized story saying that we killed 19 and wounded 50. And this was, I mean, I had sent the guy a copy of the executive summary. I sent him a copy of my polygraph. And, you know, he writes his story anyway. And so at that point, you know, I was retired from the military in 2015. And so I'm like, you know what? This guy knows better. He's a journalist, or he claims to be, but you know that's his profession, so he knows better. And it meets the 4 criteria of slander and libel. So I'm not going to talk directly to him. I actually tried to call him at first and solve it at the lowest level, but the hubris that a lot of these reporters have, they just think that, you know what, I know all this. I've been to combat, and I talked to this foolish, you know, major, and so when I didn't get any response back from this guy, I just went to his boss, who owns the Washington Post. And at that time, it was Jeff Bezos, who the CEO of Amazon, had bought the Washington Post. And then I get my phone blowing up from this reporter. Oh, you know, I know this went all the way to the top. Well, you knew better, and you had your chance.
Yeah.
I called you, and you ignored my.
I'm not sure if I'm stuck or if Fred's stuck, so I'll talk like I'm not stuck. But this case is crazy. The book's called A Few Bad Men, and the link is right below me here. You know what I always say, buddy, read, buy 2 copies, and help out Fred and the fellas who got wrapped up in this ridiculous thing. Because I'm telling you, there's a lot of things. Basically, every deployment, something crazy is going to happen in a unit, and you're like, I don't know how that happened. And thankfully, most of the time it gets worked out. But when it doesn't, it goes on the backs of the lowest ranking people. It shouldn't work that way, but that's how it works. And that's sort of what we've been talking about with this whole story. And if you don't already know the story about Fred's MARSOC unit, I can send you a link to read it. But understand that these stories quite often are presented by somebody who has an agenda. Fred was just saying how, like, I'm a reporter, I've deployed and everything else. Most likely when you're on a deployment and a reporter's there, they're the least informed person there. They quite often are there to get their story, not the story. And this is not a knock on anybody, but they don't know the job of being a war correspondent well enough to learn to be quiet and to listen and to take things in. They quite often are there for a matter of hours because it's scary. It's scary to be a reporter embedded. And so they get their story, and their story is quite often not the right thing. And they love sadly, they love these stories that like turn people into baby killers. You know, we're doing our best to not be lethal. You don't know how many times I've been on a combat patrol with infantry guys who are itching to get into a fight and disappointed that we didn't. But they are soft, like just gentle people, like petting dogs and looking at babies, and they're doing great at adapting to this impossible environment. So I was just kind of freestyling while you were gone, Fred, talking about, you know, one, buy the book. Everybody needs to buy the book. So put the link up here again. Ding, ding, ding. There's the link right there. Buy 2, because that's how you buddy read. And that's a good way to support. But just in general, you know, the reporting on these stories is quite often, like, you'll read it and you will have been there, you know, and you're like, well, that's not at all what happened, you know, and reporters do their best, but most of them are still so shell shocked when they first get there. And we all have that until you unfortunately get great at being on a combat patrol. You just are always kind of it's like someone new to the NFL. They're like, I can't believe how fast everybody is. That's sort of what a combat patrol is like until you get used to it. And quite often the reporters do that kind of thing. So you were talking about your conversation with the Washington Post person, and it kind of broke down. Would you finish that part of the story when you'd gone to Jeff Bezos and then it kind of lost comms?
Okay. Yeah, I went to Jeff Bezos, and then the reporter, straightened it. He called me back, left a voicemail. This was after I retired and I was going to business school. And so I didn't take his call, but he was all apologetic. But it's like, you had your chance. And same thing happened with another reporter, Carlotta Gall from the New York Times. She wrote several salacious articles, and then I said, hey, I'll fly to New York and meet with you face to face. And even after that, she published a book. She sat down with this then Army colonel. I think he was a 1 or 2 star in the Pentagon. He was the battle space commander at the time. And during the trial, he was a witness. He was pinned down. All his testimony is recorded, but he admitted that, okay, I was wrong. He admitted that on the stand. And then years later, but that, he had exculpatory evidence. So the prosecutors knew that. They moved the media out of the courtroom. So none of that was recorded in the public. So he thinks he's protected because his testimony was classified. And everything I've described to you, Pete, you deal in the world of not just secret, but top secret information.
Sure.
And you and I, as career professionals in the military, know better than to release any that's called spillage. And, you can't talk about it. You can't put it into print or correspond about it unless it's on approved classified channels and networks, whether they're radios or communications. But here's a guy, he knew he was protected, and because his testimony was classified. And so he speaks to this New York Times reporter, Carlotta Gall, and says, there was failures in leadership and training. He just goes on to perpetuate this lie that he admitted to in the courtroom that he was wrong. But, he went on to get promoted a few more times, all the way up to 4 stars, and he retired out of being the commander of all U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan, and now works for Lockheed Martin. But, my issue is, Pete, you and I have heard, and you've probably heard this gal, her last name escapes me right now, but her first name is Sarah. She was a CIA targeter, and she's testified before that, there's like over 1,000 Al-Qaeda trained fighters in the United States. And she's also said her and this other gentleman uses a call sign called Legend, that we and others who've testified before the House Oversight Committee that we are giving the Taliban $46 million in cash per week, and that we pay Al-Shabaab. And, I know in counterintelligence, we pay sources to, provide types of information, but when you're paying the Taliban years after the war was over, as we did in the last administration, it's like, wait a second. And some people say, hey, you know what? People are paying, the enemy all the time. Well, that's out of control when you're paying multiple tens of millions of dollars a week. And my whole point in bringing all this up is, where is the accountability? As you mentioned, if you're going to put it all on the frontline foot soldier that has all the stress put on him or her to go out there and do what they're doing, then people, that's, they have training and everything, but these other people, what they're doing is intentional. It's very deliberate. They're, they're going and giving money to our enemies that are blowing. I mean, you and I have seen what's happened to Americans that have been on the business end. Bullets and bombs is horrible. And we're paying known, warlords and leaders to continue to do this, even after we were drawn from Afghanistan. There's no accountability for that. But those kinds of people, they need to be imprisoned.
Yeah.
That approve that kind of stuff. It's awful.
Yeah. The other thing, and again, you and I know this, and so this is for the audience to understand this. We love to overclassify shit. And so if it interrupts with your rights, you and your team's rights, I'm all for declassifying almost everything. Now, look, some TS things, but you guys weren't, maybe you were. You probably weren't doing TS stuff at that moment when that happened.
Nor was the courtroom trial. None of that needed to be classified, even at the secret level.
Right.
There's no
People
reason
understand
to
that secret is perishable in terms of classification, right? It just doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
Most of the work I did, I can talk about because it was a commander in that time who wanted things. And look, by the way, it's all the same things everybody else wants. Even if it's classified, it's only classified because we don't want to find out that day that this commander wants to, no shit, go kill the Taliban. Big classified story there. It's so crazy. But they do that to obfuscate and to hide things, and it seems to other folks, but a lot of the classified you read is the most boring, mundane things. And quite often it's just obvious. Yes, of course they want to know where the Taliban is. And of course they're looking for Sheikh Pete or whatever. Like, that's just not all that sexy. And certainly a year or two after the fact, when you guys are home, not classified, Anyhow, that classification thing riles me up too. So I don't want to keep it too much longer, but thank you for coming on the show. I know we kind of got rangy because I want people to read the book. And I want them to understand what happens in these cases. When we deploy people, there's a cost for this, and it ruins people's lives. Sometimes it's through injury, sometimes it's through PTSD, sometimes it's through death, and sometimes you get swept up into a legal thing that there's just nothing you can do because this machine is going to chew up people's lives. And this is part of what the War Dragon does. So I see that Fred's spinning of this. So I'll wrap this up. Everybody, thank you so much for watching this show. I appreciate you guys checking out the Break It Down show. I should probably say like and subscribe, but you guys know that stuff. So any way you can help out, great. If you go to the PayPal link at breakitdownshow.com and put a little money in each month, that helps me out. Big help if you just even a couple of bucks a month. That's what I do for subscriptions instead of some other thing, because that money goes straight to me, and there's really no other avenue that's more direct. So PayPal is the way I like to do that. Everybody else, thank you for watching out the show. I got a couple of good ones coming up too, so just hang in there. We'll have something for you tomorrow, and I'll see you then. All right, bye-bye. And bye, Fred, if you can hear me.